There are a few things that distinguish America from other countries, and I believe one of these things to be our obsession with sports. We have Sunday night football, we have Thursday night football, and as people from Fort Worth, we have the Dallas Mavericks right near us, and I know plenty of people who love watching their games. Now, you're probably wondering what exactly sports has to do with gender, but I'll let you know. If you keep up with the NBA, then you've probably heard of Dwayne Wade, who is a player for the Miami Heat. Now, Wade has a few children, and one of his children was born biologically male, and they named him Zion. But recently, Wade's family has been in the news because Zion came forward to his parents and said, "Hey, Mom and Dad, actually, I don't want to be called Zion anymore. I want you to call me Zaya, and I want people to refer to me using female pronouns." Now, this might raise a question for American society. Of course, we do not know exactly what Zaya's future career path will be, but there's the chance that Wade passes down his love of sports to his children. This makes us wonder and ask the question, should we allow transgender athletes in sports? Now, some people, you ask this question and they will say obviously yes, and other people you ask this question and they will say obviously no. But I'm here to argue that the reason American society in the 21st century treats gender so subjectively is because of the way we changed our view of gender roles during the 20th century. In order to understand my argument, there are three main time periods you must grasp. The first is the pre-1900s to 1900, the second is from 1900 to 2000, and the last is from 2000 until now and even into the future. Now, during the first time period, the pre-1900s to 1900, there weren't too many advances in the way American society viewed women, so I will begin to tell you important events starting with my second time period. At the beginning of the 20th century, the first main event that changed the way American society viewed women was the First World War. See, before the First World War, the women typically stayed at home and they took care of the children and they took care of the house, while the men worked the office jobs and the manual labor jobs and the jobs that people typically viewed as making society run and making the world go round. But once World War I happened, all the men had to leave their jobs empty, and the only people who could take over these jobs were the women. In fact, the women actually did this quite well, and they took over these jobs, and because they were able to do this, American society realized women can actually do more than we thought they could. Then the second important event from the beginning of the 20th century was that of Prohibition. When the men came back from the war, many had horrible, traumatic memories of their friends dying in combat and felt that the only way to get rid of these memories was to drink them away. And this meant that not only were the men not spending time with their families that they should have been spending, but they were also spending all the family's money at bars. Now, Prohibition occurred around the time that women had just gained the right to vote. So women were actually able to exercise a say in society for the first time around the time of Prohibition. The third important event that changed the way women were viewed from the beginning of the 20th century was that of the Jazz Age, also known as the Roaring Twenties. Now during this time, as I mentioned previously, when the men had come back from the war, many went to things like alcohol to try to get rid of their memories, but also many threw lavish parties with drugs as well and much sexual immorality. But of course you did not only have the men at the parties, you also had the women at the parties. And the fact that women participated in these events showed society that women could actually still participate in more than just taking care of the children at home. Then we moved to the middle of the 20th century. The main important event from the middle of the 20th century was that of the Civil Rights era. Now, of course, race is not directly related to gender, but when Rosa Parks came forward and showed the American society that the way black people were treated was not right, many Americans realized, well, maybe there are other groups of people that we're not treating properly. And because America was open to these ideas, Simone de Beauvoir came onto the scene around the 1950s and said, hey, the way we're treating women is not proper either, and thus people were more open to her ideas. Then, at the end of the 20th century, the main event that has changed the way women are viewed is the spark and popularity of social media. Now, of course, before the internet, you could call someone and have a conversation with them, but after the popularity of the internet, you could have a conversation with someone 1,000 miles away, and someone you don't even know can jump into your conversation. And that conversation can be recorded on the internet. And because it was so easy to have these kinds of conversations about gender and the great gender debate, there were more opportunities for feministic ideas to be spread within our modern society. But now we're in the 21st century, and social media's influence has only taken off even more. Any random person, any commoner, you might say, could post an idea to Twitter and 100, if not 1,000 or 1,000,000 people could see it in a matter of minutes. The way this social media has taken off in 21st century has led to so many ideas, especially feministic ideas, being spread and accepted much more easily. Now, in addition to this event, Caitlyn Jenner came forward in 2015, previously Bruce Jenner, famous Olympic athlete, and said, "I am transgender, refer to me using female pronouns." Because of this act that many deemed to be bravery, a multitude of other celebrities and even more common folk came forward and said the same thing. They felt empowered to say, "I am transgender, I am not binary," anything that was not considered the norm. Okay, now that I have explained the important events from certain time periods, I can move on to explaining the waves of feminism. Now, some believe that there are 3 waves of feminism, while others believe that there are 4, but for the purposes of this argument, I will treat feminism as if it has 4 waves. The first wave of feminism occurred at the tail end of the 1800s, but really around the beginning of the 1900s, when the women said, "We just want the right to vote, we want suffrage, we want something as simple as that." Then the second wave of feminism was around the 1940s to the 1970s, when the women said, "We want to be able to hold a lot of the same social offices as men." Then the third wave of feminism occurred around the 1990s, and what really set this wave of feminism apart was that women were no longer just dealing with women's problems. It was also dealing with other problems of other oppressed groups within society, which we call intersectional, this idea that you're dealing with multiple groups' problems. Now, the fourth wave of feminism began around 2010 and is still occurring now. And the thing that identifies this wave of feminism is mainly its usage of social media to convey the feministic ideas, and also the fact that many movements have stemmed from it, such as the Me Too movement. But in any debate about gender, it is extremely important to define your terms, and many go about this and write books even without explaining what exactly they're meaning. So I will explain the difference between sex and gender. Now, sex is generally anatomical and physiological. It is more of a biological reality and it's related to genitalia. But gender, on the other hand, is much more closely rooted in cultural and societal differences rather than biological ones. Now, with events having been explained and the ways of feminism having been explained and important definitions having been explained, I can move on to clarifying the relationship between role distinctions and gender distinctions. Role distinctions foster gender distinctions and vice versa. Gender distinctions foster role distinctions. Now this might be kind of confusing at first. You might not be sure what I mean, but I'll give you an example. Say you have a supermarket and you have 4 workers, and all 4 of your workers are bagging groceries. Well, if they're all doing the exact same thing, they're all bagging groceries, there's really no reason to have a certain amount of male workers or a certain amount of female workers, because with no role distinction, you don't need a gender distinction. But take the same supermarket and say you need some of your employees to come lift boxes off of the truck, and you have 2 male employees and you have 2 female employees, well, you're likely to choose the male employees because the gender distinctions foster the role distinctions, because their bodies are made innately differently. Now, do you believe that this is just a stereotype that men being made differently means anything for their roles, or do you think there's actually something to this innate difference? Well, if you ask Planned Parenthood lists 4 main gender stereotypes on their website, and I will speak of 2 of them here. The first of these is a behavioral stereotype. Planned Parenthood's website says that men are extremely rough and tumble and aggressive, and that this is just how society has conditioned them to be, but there's not actually any substance to this idea. Well, if we take a further look at it, many studies have been done even across species that say that if you compare the male to the male is always more aggressive and domineering. And this is obviously not just something that society has conditioned us to be. The second gender stereotype that I will speak of is the stereotype of dress. Planned Parenthood's website says, men and women dressing so differently is just something that society has forced upon them. It's not something that really happens for any reason, it is simply a stereotype. Well, again, if we think about this, as I mentioned earlier, gender distinctions foster gender roles, and because the men's bodies are made differently, they typically work different jobs, and the clothing they wear directly relates to the jobs they work. So this idea of men and women wearing different clothing and it being society just forces them to is not accurate. Okay, now that I've explained the relationship between gender distinctions and gender roles, I can move back on to talking about my first time period, the pre-1900s to 1900. Now, during this time, America would have claimed to be a Christian society. Now, I'm not here to argue that everyone you walk up to on the street would be able to recite their Bible front to back, but I would argue that anyone you walk up onto the street would say, yes, I'm a Christian, and yes, America is a Christian society. Now, John MacArthur wrote a book titled Different by Design, and in this book he laid out the roles of men and women as they're presented in the Bible. And thus we can believe that MacArthur's exegesis of biblical roles of men and women would be similar to what American society believed to be the roles of man and woman. Now, MacArthur said that Adam was created first, and thus he was to be the head, that he was told to take care of the garden in Genesis 2, that man is commanded to love his wife as Christ loved the church in Ephesians 5, but really in 1 Timothy 5:8, we are told that the man is to be the provider. Now, he explains the woman's roles, that Eve was created after Adam and thus as a helper for him. He explains that the woman is to be a wife and a mother, that she's to focus on the home, that she is called to pour her time and energy into her family. And he points out Proverbs 31 that gives the ideal woman, as well as Deuteronomy 6 that explains that the woman is to be generous with her neighbors, that she is to be absolutely devoted to her family. See, whether or not these are the exact roles that American society would have believed, we still recognize, and they still recognized, that men and women held distinct roles. Even an author at the end of the 1800s named Catherine Beecher, in one of her works especially geared for women, stated that not only should men and women have the opportunity to work different roles, but that they should in fact be working different roles. And this is typically the way society viewed this idea of gender roles until around the 1950s when Simone de Beauvoir came onto the scene. Now, Simone de Beauvoir was really the first person who gained significant attention because of her radical feministic ideas. She thought that even something such as marriage was demeaning because in the past it was always a financial transaction between the husband and the father. She thought that women should be able to have more control over their bodies, and her really radical idea was that birth control should be legal and that abortion should be legal. And this was the first time something like this had really been argued for. But even though she disliked the way American society treated women and how much power men had over women, she still recognized that men and women were distinct. Now, we can see, as we look through the waves of feminism, how their goals have really changed as they progressed. The first wave of feminism said, women don't have enough power, we need to raise them up to the level of men. And that's the same thing that was occurring during the second wave of feminism. But when the third wave of feminism came about, it became less of drawing women up to the level of men, but more of bringing men down to the level of women. A famous third wave feminist named Rebecca Walker wrote a book titled Becoming the Third Wave, and in this book she said, what sets apart third wave feminism from the other waves of feminism is that it is ingrained into every part of your life. And really the main thing is that you're actively challenging power structures. It was less of a peaceful revolt and now more of an obvious and more of a revolt that was meant to bring others down rather than bringing women up. Okay, now that I've explained the second time period, I can move on to how this has impacted our third time period, which is the 21st century. During the 21st century, we have a kind of mob mentality within our society. We have a kind of cancel culture. If you do one thing wrong, your career is ruined, especially within the realm of celebrities. And so many celebrities are very careful to not step on anyone's toes, to just agree to whatever offends the least amount of people. People believed from the 20th century, I can do anything I want to do. And this led to a I can be anything I want to be kind of mindset. And with the rest of the world saying, oh, I don't want to offend anyone, society just lets everyone be what they want to be. See, because in our 21st century, role distinctions have been nearly eliminated, this is why we have an inability to articulate or to perceive any substantive gender distinction. Even parents intentionally do not teach their children masculinity or femininity when they are born. Some parents disregard the M or the F printed on a birth certificate. The birth certificate doesn't even mean anything to certain parents anymore because they believe that the children should have the right to grow up and and behave whatever way they want to do so. This gender binary that used to be accepted as a fact by everyone within society is not even deemed necessary. But to put this in perspective, looking at the LGBT community, they accept over 63 genders. I will list some of them here: agender, bigender, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, gender questioning, gender variant, gender queer, non-binary, pangender, transgender, transsexual, and two-spirit. And these are just a few of the 63 recognized genders. But in fact, it's obvious that it's not only the LGBT community that accepts this. If we look at a huge corporation like Facebook, when you make an account, they offer over 50 gender options. This idea that people can act however they want to act, that led to this idea of people can be whatever they want to be and no one can step on anyone's toes, is the reason that society treats gender the way it does today. A member of the LGBT community themselves, named Lee Ayrton, said in one of their books, "We can think of gender as a process a person participates in that is never complete, not just something a person is." Ultimately, due to our disintegration of gender roles within American society, gender distinctions have turned from something that was so obviously established, accepted, and objective to something that is uncertain, denied, and subjective. Now, after hearing all this, do you think that Zaya should be allowed in sports and on a female sports team? Do you think that it's right because of the different chemicals and hormones in her body? See, some will continue to argue obviously yes, and others will continue to argue obviously no. But ultimately, through all this, we can see, as the waves of feminism progressed, that the feminist search for gender equality quickly spiraled into a desire to erase all gender distinctions. Now, many view this as a fantastic step forward in our American society, as we need to be more progressive, and this is how we're doing it. We're finally getting there. But many other Americans who believe that America should still be a Christian society say, no, this is a horrible step in the wrong direction. We're going completely off the path that God intended us to be. Now, whether you believe that this is a great thing or a bad thing, it is ultimately evident that the 20th century's changed understanding of the roles of men and women has played a significant part in leading to the 21st century's definition of gender as fluid. Thank you. I talked a lot faster when I did it here than when I did it